Hey, I'm the owner of L&B Counseling. My name's Trent Morrow. I appreciate y'all being here. I realize that most people will listen to this as a recording. If you're like me, sometimes I sign up for things and knowing I can't be there just because of the time. And then I'll go back and listen to it later. So if you are one of those people, my email address is going to be at the end of the talk. And if you have questions, or even if you'd like to give this talk or any other talk, to somewhere in the community, you can just reach out that way, ask me a question, and I promise I'll get back to you as soon as possible. This talk really came out of just giving other presentations and talking to other adults who are parents. And a lot of times they'll come up and say, like, how much time, screen time should I have? I have a 2-year-old, or how should I handle this issue or that issue? And so just them kind of feeling ambiguous about what to do on certain situations. So this is by no means, there isn't a handbook, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. But just some general ideas to take away for you as a parent, with some of the challenges that you have as a parent, and it's by far the most important thing you'll ever do in your life, and it'll certainly probably be the hardest thing you ever do in your life, to be a parent. But there's just some general ideas and guidance around these things. So the things we're going to talk about, which is what we talk about almost in all of our talks, is just kind of what the problem, what it looks like, how it may be showing up for you as a parent, or even you in your kiddos, in your children. And then we'll talk about, solutions, a paradigm for how you can think about applying some of the things that you're going to learn to kind of have an operationalized system, and then tools you can use and resources that you can use to kind of manage your life and your kids' life. So just for context and clarity, there's different attachment styles. You predominantly get those as a child, with your own relationships to your caregivers, however good or bad that may be. So, half of Americans have what we'd call a healthy attachment style. So they feel secure in their relationships. They don't feel a lot of ambivalence in their relationships, or angst. And the other half feel something different. And they can be broken up into avoidant, anxious, avoidant. The part to pay attention to here is that that number, that half, has been on the decline, right? So more and more people are having, lack of better words, unhealthy attachment styles. And so that line, that curve is going down, which, as we'll talk about, you can see how this may play out as if you're feeling this way, and then you have this as a parent, and how that can be projected sometimes onto our children, how that may have some negative consequences. There's obviously a lot of information. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. A lot of information out there these days. Information's great. You want to think of it like food. There's a lot of food out there. Probably most of it is not good for us. And information is kind of the same. There's a lot of information out there. Not all of it is great information. And so it can be a little dizzying trying to make sense of, what is real, what should I do, how should I use it, that kind of thing. The world you grew up in, speaking to you parents, is very different than the one now that your children are growing up in. Probably, we tend to have this revisionist history of like, well, yeah, back in my day, and it was like that, and what's much different. And some things we'll talk about, so that it is different. It just is different. The speed of change, the world, the virtual world that we live in versus the physical world is very different than how you grew up, I would imagine. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and the impact of that. People of all ages are reporting more mental health challenges. We'll also talk about that, and how there's not necessarily a paradigm for that if you didn't grow up with that or used to that. And so that can certainly be dizzying as far as how to make sense of something if you don't have perspective or insight about it, and having to go learn that information if it is something that is impacting maybe you, but particularly your children. Which means sometimes it feels like there's fewer resources and it's harder to find good information. And then this sense of threat or danger seems to have increased, and if we're just talking to kind of like the 5-mile, 10-mile radius of 28277, for the most intensive parts, it is a safe area, and less prone to violence when you look that up on statistics, crime statistics, but it can feel like there's a greater sense of threat or danger. We'll talk about some of where those feelings come from. So these attachment styles that we talked about, secure is what you would think, right? I'm good. I feel safe. It's the child that the 2-year-old or the 1-year-old that can be in the room and kind of go explore, not just run away and never come back. That may be more the avoidant, but kind of go explore, may take a little look back every now and then to make sure, hey, I'm good, I'm safe, like mom, dad, caregiver hasn't left. And so they just kind of keep, as you can imagine, that keeps expanding, that radius keeps expanding over time. The avoidant is someone that doesn't, you know, they've learned that they don't need or they can't count on that caregiver. And so their avoidance shows up as just not being able to be vulnerable, to be maybe even present, and be available generally emotionally is because the defense mechanisms closes that off. And then the anxious is someone that is needing reassurance, checking in constantly. They won't stray ever too far, and as soon as they do, they come right back to make sure that you know they're safe, or a lot less limit testing when it comes to things like that because the world just feels unsafe to them. So going back to that earlier idea is like secure is on the decline, anxious and avoidant is on the incline, and so that can have pretty strong ramifications that continues in that manner, and on that trend. So think about who your influences are. Personally, and you know, kind of your parents obviously were the biggest influencer over you as a parent and how you're going to parent, like it or not. You know, we always say like, well, I wouldn't do it that way, I won't do it that way. Inevitably, they're just, you know, baked into your world as far as your learned behaviors and even some of your DNA. And so those are really strong influencers. Your cohort of friends, people that you're talking to, hey, I didn't know this, I can't get my kid to sleep, and potty training, whatever it is, whatever stage of development it is, the cohort, the people that you talk to, are going to be ways that you problem solve and get your information. Blogs, if you like reading, the rise of the, you know, the internet itself, kind of going back to what's different now than it even was when we grew up. I was born in '74, so I really didn't have the internet, so I went off to college. And now, you know, there's a blog about everything. There's tons of blogs about parenting. The social media has 31.4 million accounts that are dedicated, let's call it influencers, that are dedicated to parenting. So it's big business, because if you get people to those blogs, those social medias, you know, you get income through those ways. Obviously, TV and movies may influence you in some way. If it's a documentary, may influence you in some way, but just stuff in general. Like we're easily influenced as much as we don't think we are. Books, going back to blogs, workshops. If you're investing time in learning, I'm sure you did a lot of that the first time you had a job. You probably just didn't rely on, hey, I've got it, I can figure it out, I'll know what to do. You probably invested time in learning. You know, I went to the daddy boot camp for the first child. I didn't do it for the second child. So you're probably trying to get good information when it comes to that, things about what to expect in the beginning and how to handle some of these situations. And then over time, you may invest less time into books and into reading and into workshops. And then apps, just so you know, like, you know, over $500 million is generated on apps when you are looking for information and advice on how to deal with parenting situations. So as we were kind of alluding to earlier, like part of the reason the world is so different now is the virtual world, for the most part, didn't exist, depending on how old you are. But certainly even, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that virtual world was pretty much non-existent for most of the population. You know, the iPhone didn't come into online till '09, so you know it's still fairly young. It's quite young in the evolution of just how we have been conditioned. So you got these two things that are occurring: human condition and environment. Environment usually is a stronger influencer over human condition than human condition is an environment. So you think of like kindergarten class, you know, after the first week or two, kids understand carpet time. They know to sit down, to listen to the teacher, blah, blah, blah. You may have one or two individuals in that class who don't really ascribe to the environment and sitting down and being quiet, and maybe they're running around the room or blurting out answers or whatever it may be, right? So sometimes human condition is stronger than environment, but generally environment is stronger than human condition. So you have these two worlds that we live in now, right? The virtual world and the physical world. A lot of communication as parents is through the virtual world. It is through a text, it's through FaceTime, it's through all these different means. It's not, you know, my daughter went off to college, and when I was in college, you had to pick up the phone and maybe decide a time when you were going to be there to talk or send a letter or a care package. You know, that part of the world has changed dramatically. And so there's a trade-off. It's good stuff and bad stuff. So just knowing that these two places exist is very important. We allow our kids a lot of times to go into spaces virtually that we probably would not allow them in physically. So if it was, someone up the street, I want to go play at their house, you may want to know a little bit more information about them. You may have a certain set of assumptions about that house. If you have a frame of reference, them going into Roblox is like going into Disney World, and you have no idea where they're going to be, what they're going to do, who they're going to get in contact with, because it's a whole nother universe, Roblox in and of itself. And so there's a lot of these virtual neighborhoods where kids and even adults go into that you don't have a frame of reference to really understand who all lives there, how do they act, what are the norms, what's safe, what's not safe. And so that alone has made it very difficult to parent. The way we learn and work has changed a lot. Obviously, we all lived through COVID. That learning and working was on full display. And some of those things are still in place. Some of those habits are still in place, good or bad. But it's just a different way that we consume information than you did as, someone your child's age. Social media, access to information, all these things are very different. And so it's tough to make sense. Social media is its own kind of different environment, depending on what app you're on, and even what you're following, who you're following. Had access to information. Your kids are by far the smartest generation at this point. Now, maybe it goes back to that information is not always good information, but they have access to information. And so they'll have a point, counterpoint to things that you may be discussing, or they may be more informed on the topic than the thing that you're trying to parent, because they have access to all that information. So the, hey, just do it because I'm the parent, because I told you so, becomes over time sometimes harder to parent, because they're like, but this is not what it says here, or that's not true. Why did you say that, kind of thing? There's also increase in apathy across the board. This is multi-generational. This isn't just about children. Some kids are slower to launch. We are seeing that particularly in boys and younger boys, kind of slower to get into adulthood and life. I think most parents would like their kids to be financially independent and have some level of happiness. And that financial independence, in cases, is sometimes taking longer to get to. And so is that happiness too. And then there's more time inside, and that may be just in the room or on devices. And there's certainly been a decline in hobbies. As far as high school goes, most kids don't exercise. The majority of kids don't exercise. They drop hobbies. And some of that is like our world. They may be focused on their studies so they can get into the college of their choice. But these things are happening. They do have some ramifications, and they're just trade-offs that you have to consider as a parent of what's okay. If they're going to drop a hobby, do they need to pick up another one? How much time inside is okay, or how much time in their room away from the family is okay? And then we've got, the mental wellness side of things. Certainly a rise in all these things, and whether you've experienced it or you've read up on it, sometimes it's really hard to know how to parent it. If your kid comes to you and says, hey, I don't feel well, you're probably going to put, a thermometer in their mouth and just see if they have a temperature and if they have a fever, and then you'll act accordingly depending on what that number says, right? We don't really have anything for all these other things. It's hard to say, like, how depressed are you? How anxious are you in this moment? How bad is your ADHD in this moment? Sometimes it's on display and other times it's not. So it becomes more challenging as a parent to, one, know what this is, know what the symptoms are, what the signs are. And then on a scale of intensity, how intense is it? And what does that mean in that moment as far as how you parent that child in that environment and how much you push them or don't push them. And then we have, the last one is prevalence inflation. And simply put, it is what we can see, particularly in the practice, is if something's trending on TikTok, we'll call it disassociation or even borderline personality disorder. There tends to be more, well, I think I have this. And so that inflated prevalence that, hey, I have this, when, for instance, like 1% of the population is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or disassociation, and we're now seeing 10 people in a week. Those two things don't match up. And so sometimes just the idea that you may have something or your child's coming to you because, going back to, they've seen it, read it, studied more about it, they're now coming to you. I think I have X, Y, or Z. And one, you may have never heard of it. Two, you have heard of it, but you don't really have the information to say, well, let's look at it a little deeper. And so it can create that sense of, hey, I have something when indeed they maybe don't have that something. We've got a scarcity of resources, at least the assumption that there is. There is some proof that, the top 10 to 12 universities, those do matter as far as outcome of income. There's really close study that, your income and outcome of income is more indicative of where you apply than where you get in. But the idea that I need to do all the things to get into the right school, whatever school that may be, and understanding that. I think parents understand that, kids certainly feel that in the environment, particularly where we are. And so those things matter. That college choice is now tied into housing and living wage. And, for the first time in history, like this generation that's coming up is predicted to make less over time than their parents. And so there's all these things that kind of factor in that make it more stressful for parents and for kids when it comes to affordability and being on the right track, doing the right thing, picking the right school or major or whatever it may be. So there's a confluence of stuff that makes this a lot more stressful and a stressful time for parents and for kids dealing with a lot of these things. And then we have, the haunted house syndrome that we call it here at the practice, which is like stuff could happen. We don't know when, we just kind of expect that it will. And so there's a lot of fear of violence and threat, school shootings. You got, in some cases, preschools doing school shooting, active shooter drills, and that can be very dysregulating for a kiddo. And then how that is parented at home and how it's, reinforced, those kind of things certainly affects the central nervous system and how the body gets used to these things. There's stuff going on in the world. We have much more availability of information about that things. We can learn a lot more about it, whether it's real or not. And I mean, as far as the information goes. So it can create this haunted house syndrome of like, wow, it's really rough out there. And you can look at this in the economy, like, hey, the economy is really bad. But when you go ask someone personally, like, hey, how is it for you? It's like, well, it's not that bad for me. Depending on who you ask, but it feels like it is or could be. And so I just say all this to kind of package it. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening that makes things more challenging now, more than ever, to be a parent and know how to manage a lot of these things and have these conversations. It can be very tricky. So we're going to talk about the parenting styles. Some of these you've heard of. The one at the bottom is, and then the permissive, authoritarian, authoritative. Permissive is like, hey, go do whatever you want. I don't really care. Authoritarian is like my rule. It's the dictator, my way or the highway. It doesn't matter what you think. You don't have a thought. Just do what I say. Authoritative is just a more balanced approach. Talk more about these top four, just to kind of give reference. I'm sure you've heard of helicopter and snowplow. Point here is not to demonize one thing or the other, just to see that the trade-offs on all of them, and how those styles work and where they could be effective and maybe where they're not effective. So natural growth is, if you want to think of more like the Montessori approach to parenting, it's unstructured. You just, you kind of do what you want to do. It allows for greater creativity, allows you to kind of get into the things that you're really into. Certainly a lot more independence. They can produce more problem solving, can have very clear boundaries. The consequence of that natural growth, you just kind of learn some natural consequences, like, yeah, I shouldn't do this because that happened, or I touched this and it did that. And I can pick up a black ant, but I can't pick up a red ant because it's going to bite me, kind of thing. And then the downside is sometimes they may need more direction because of this unstructured play. Sometimes when you get into situations or systems or environments where more direction is required, sometimes there's a struggle for that individual to be in that environment. Maybe timid around those authority figures, and then less exposure to hobbies because maybe you're just wanting to do the one thing and that's what you keep doing, and therefore you just have less exposure to less things. Then the concerted cultivation. This is someone that has, like a parent that has a more hands-on approach. So you think of concerted cultivation as like, all right, we're going to plan the activities. We're going to make sure you're doing these things. We may check the Life 360 a lot just to kind of see where you are and make sure you're doing what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. So the upside on that is a lot of advocacy. So the parents advocating a lot for these things that they think their child needs. And this goes back to that monitoring and activities. There, you may have more dearth of activities because that parent is like, all right, you need to, you need to do tutoring, you need to do piano, you need to do soccer. And so they're kind of managing the things that their child could do. The downside is the child learns to have less agency. Sometimes they can be overcommitted and overscheduled is a better way to say that. And then an over reliance on that caregiver to kind of make decisions for them, to do things for them. And so they over time just kind of learn not how to do things for themselves, which down the line could be a problem. Then we got the helicopter parent. So the upside on that is there's certainly increased safety because you're monitoring to make sure your kiddo isn't getting hurt or stumbling, bloody up their knee, that kind of stuff. Certainly a strong relationship because you're tight and you're close with your kid. You're around your kid a lot, just proximity. And there's greater academic success because you're making sure that the assignment was done on time. You know when the test is. You know when the next thing is due. You know when the deadlines are for whatever it may be. It could be a club, it could be school, whatever. And so there's more monitoring of that, which allows for there to be greater success. The downside is, there's less agency again for the kiddo. They're not learning to manage things themselves or how to develop a system, problem solve, that kind of thing. That can lead to some increased stress and friction, particularly once you get into those tweens and teen age, because tweens and teens, particularly teenagers, their whole deal is, agency. They want to have control. They want to have competence and they want to have relatedness, and relatedness is through peers, not through the parents generally. And so there's an increased stress if that type of parent style continues throughout the arc of development. And that would call that strained relationship because it's creating that friction and they're wanting some things that maybe the helicopter parent at certain times is not ready to give away, or maybe the child hasn't displayed the ability to do it yet. Got the snowplow, who is the person that just, hey, is removing obstacles. This can be good depending on what some of those obstacles are. They may need help advocating for certain things because maybe they're not getting what they need. Maybe they have a learning disability and they're not getting the different interventions that they're by law required to get, or even that are written into the 504 IEP. And so they're doing immediate resolutions, really high level of support, and then a head start without those obstacles, which can be good depending on what the obstacles are. Now, the trade-off is if you remove all the obstacles, then the kiddo never learns to be more resilient. So they have lower resiliency and less self-efficacy, believing that they can do hard things. If you apply that across the board, the more dependency on the caregiver to do the things for them, and then underdeveloped coping skills because if they don't encounter stressful events, then they never learn to develop those skills to deal with stressful events. So how it shows up in your kiddos is higher expectations than capable at the time. So you're going to see that behavior when they are not able to meet that expectation of time because it may be too great. And it could be, you're going to take 4 APs and, maybe they're really good in 3 of those subjects, but the 4th is not their strongest subject, and maybe they'd have been better off in honors. And so you just may see apathy, you may see some despondency, you may see obstinance where they're just pushing back on it. And so it could show up in different ways. Lower self-esteem due to the lack of the secure relationship. So you're seeing that behavior of like, I'm not good at this, or I'm not good at everything. They can be a little more global and cynical about things. Poor understanding of boundaries sometimes, depending on the parenting style that's being used in those situations and those environments. So, if you got the kind of kid that is a Montessori style of parenting and like they're just pushing through boundaries, they're not recognizing that there are boundaries in place and you need to respect people's boundaries. Certainly the behavior problems, the low efficacy, like we talked about, and you're going to see poor problem solving for someone at that age. It's like, hey, this kiddo should understand how to do this, but yet they're still not displaying the ability to do it. It could just be because they hadn't really learned earlier how to encounter that problem and then what to do with it. You also will see it with some of these parenting styles, a lot of perfectionism. There's different types of perfectionism. We have a whole talk on this. We have a whole talk on all these pieces of somatic complaints. But you have the individual that's perfectionistic, which we often tend to think of like the person that's got to make 100 on everything. And really hard on themselves, which is true. There is that, but there's also the environmental perfectionism, which is just the environment itself. The environment could be a classroom, it could be your house. Um, and so it would show up as perfectionism, like I got to nail this all the time. And so there's a high proclivity for insecurity and anxiety causing that perfectionism because of the system, not necessarily the person, not the human condition, but the environment. Um, and then, you would start seeing it in depression and anxiety, particularly anxiety that's undiagnosed. More than likely, you're going to develop depression within a year, statistically. And then you just see poor social relationships. You see regression. It could be poor social relationships in the family. It could be outside of the family. But you're just going to see that over time because they're struggling to interact because they didn't develop the skills over time to deal with hard conversations and resiliency and that kind of stuff. And then obviously you could see it through somatic complaints of people say my stomach hurts, I have a headache, these kind of things, or just eating frequent often because their body's not used to stress. And getting stress in little dips is good because it builds the body up, it helps the immune system. But high levels of stress turns into chronic stress. It actually puts a wear and tear on the immune system, which makes you more likely to get sick. So we're going to talk about these in more detail, just as far as solutions. So we kind of talked about what the problem is, what it could look like, some of the trade-offs, that kind of things, the challenges of being a parent in this time and day. But we're going to talk about parenting paradigms. I want you to think about stress check systems, framework for having hard conversations, because inevitably, if you're a parent, or a caregiver, you're going to have hard conversations. You need to know how to have them. And then things you can do for yourself and for your family from a healthy human recipe standpoint, and then tools that help you manage stress. So, the optimal way to do the parenting stuff is creating a growth mindset in your kiddo through a supportive and caring relationship that has high standards and accountability. So the kid knows that you care about them, you're producing curiosity, you're producing resiliency through supportive caring relationships. But you're saying like, hey, in math, I know you're an A student, and in English, I know a B. Given your history and maybe the teacher and whatever the case may be, it's like, so we're going to make you accountable for a B over here and an A over here, and kind of defining like what is the optimal output look like given the situation for per environment, rather than saying, all right, you need to make A's in everything you do forever until the end of time. That may not be a good way to approach it. So the Swiss Army knife is there for very good reason. Like all those parenting styles they went through, those parenting styles work really well given the environment and given the human condition of your child, right? So it's knowing your human condition of your child and then knowing the environment that they can operate that growth mindset in and what that looks like from a high standard standpoint. Then you can set the accountability around it. So if someone is very shy and you know that about them, like giving them little things that they can do over time to build that self-confidence and self-efficacy in a social setting. And it may be that you just join the group. It's not that you participate on the group or you talk in the group or you're the leader of the group or president of the group. But it's finding ways within those environments to apply some of those parenting styles. So sometimes you want to remove barriers. Sometimes you want them to be barriers away. Sometimes you need to check behind your child. Sometimes you want them to go out and explore on their own. And sometimes, depending on the child, they're not great at doing that. Or you need to shorten the amount of time that you're giving them to do that. So it's learning about all these because they're not good or bad. They're optimal in certain situations, in certain environments, based upon the human condition of your child. So another paradigm to use is, and we'll talk about this in a slide or two, but just knowing your own stress is very important. And I'm kind of pointing to this part of your sympathetic nervous system, which is located here. But knowing your stress meter is really important when you're engaging as a parent. So 1 to 10, 10 is you're highly dysregulated, and 1 is everything's chill, hopefully on a beach, enjoying a vacation. So knowing where your number is going to make you more prone, or it's going to make you more vulnerable to managing that parenting situation well. So understanding that matters. Now, sometimes you're in a situation where, regardless of what your meter is, you need to act. but most of the time we're not in that situation. And so we'll talk about a system you can use to catch that. We're going to talk about how to set limits, and to do that in a way that avoids these power struggles that a lot of times parents get into that causes a lot of friction, and where you get to the point of like, well, you're going to lose your phone forever. So not getting yourself back into a corner where you feel like you don't have any options is really important. So that power struggle piece is really important for parents, so you just don't feel worn down. Asking for one thing at a time is really important. You don't want to stack too many things at once, unless you think they can handle a couple things at a time, but the brain's not really great at remembering things. It's great at doing things. It's great for ideas. It's not always great as a file type. And if your stress meter is up higher, your child is dysregulated, like a 7, 8, or 9, it's even worse as far as remembering the things that you're trying to get it to do. Sometimes you need to use a token system just to get that behavior going. So sometimes you need the carrot to start building that momentum. And we talk a little bit about that too. And then it's important to write things down, particularly when you're asking kids to do something. And you could text it to them. You can get on a piece of paper and like, hey, I need you to clean your room up. But just doing that is just a redundancy way to make sure that information is shared effectively, but also remembered. That way they can say, well, I didn't hear you say that. So setting limits. First rule, make sure it's fair and enforceable before you ask. So make sure it is something that you can do given the environment and given the human condition in that moment. So if they're highly dysregulated, you got a 2-year-old crying in the aisle at Walmart because they want the candy bar. And if you're like, if you don't stop crying in 1 minute, I'm never bringing you to Walmart again. Like, that's not fair in that moment because that child's dysregulation is so high that they're not processing information. And therefore they're not going to remember that in the context of maybe next time. And they don't understand what's on the line. It's just they're in the moment of a puddle of a human, and understanding that at scale and understanding that across all age parameters is very important, regardless of age. I mean, we're talking about adults too. Second rule, make a request with a specific time limit and explain the reason and what is on the line or not if you request. So for instance, hey, I need you to clean your room. If you have a challenging kid, you may want to take a picture of what a clean room looks like. So they have a frame of reference and say, well, it is clean. Well, no, it's not clean. No, it is. So you don't get into that power struggle. So you're defining what is clean. You say, hey, you got till 5 o'clock today to clean your room. If you clean it, then you're going to be able to keep your electronics. If you don't clean it by 5 o'clock to the standard that we agreed to, you're going to lose your electronics until you clean the room, or you'll lose it for an hour, or you're going to lose it for the rest of the day, whatever it may be, right? You're not going to lose it for life. But you make that request, you give a specific time, and after that, you do not nag, right? Well, it's 2 o'clock, you ain't cleaned that room yet. So you give them the thing that you're expecting them to do, you'd write it down, make sure it's fair and enforceable, and then you don't nag. And then you follow through with the promise or the reward, promise of a reward, excuse me, or a consequence once that thing has been done. And this requires you being very level-headed so you don't get dysregulated if you're being challenged, and every child should challenge you on limits, unless it's the anxious child who all they want to do is make sure that you love them and you never leave them. But outside of that, like, you have to set limits, follow through, not nag, and be able to be level-headed so you can make adjustments as you go, depending on how that human condition is operating in that environment. So the emotional temperature gauge, if you ever hear my talk, it's always in my talk. As you become dysregulated, your brain becomes less able to deal with the reality of the world. So at worst case, your IQ can drop 30 to 40 points. That's also true for your kiddos. So just imagine the impact that would have on your IQ and your ability to process information and make rational, sane decisions. So understanding your stress is very, very important. I doubt any of you have any sort of technology that tells you what your cortisol levels are. We have tech now that, based upon the temperature that your watch is reading of your internal state, will change the thermostat, make it go up or down, right? Which is awesome. But we don't have anything that says, hey, your stress is at this level. You could look at your heart rate maybe, but even then, that's not necessarily indicative of your cortisol levels. and cortisol is lagging. So you may feel it after it's already been pumping for a little bit. And so it doesn't just like stop and shut off right when you catch it and say, oh, my stress is too high. You still got to deal with the ramifications of all those neurochemicals being dumped into your system. So it's really important to know where you're at in these parenting decisions and just generally in life and relationships, so you can effectively manage the situation, or step away from it because the environment is too dysregulating when you can, too dysregulating, to get yourself your temperature down, which we'll put it here at the end, kind of show you some tools that you can do for that. But really, really important in these moments when you're having these conversations with in these environments with relationships that you really care about, whether it's your kiddo or just people that you care about in your life, to understand your stress state and understand the impact it has on outcomes. The other thing that you got your stress state, you're gonna have this thing. You need to be a parent. You need to, and this is applicable to not just being a parent. As far as hard conversations, you can use this in your work. You can do this with your significant other, whoever, a friend. But having hard conversations is an art. Understanding your stress level starts like that is step one. And being aware of it throughout the conversation, because you should be dysregulated, it should be uncomfortable because it's a hard conversation. You may want it at a 4, 5, or 6 because that allows for some growth to occur. You may not want an 8, 9, or 10 because that will probably be counterproductive. So just having an awareness of that is step one. But be clear about what you hope to achieve with your kiddo. We'll relate this to parenting. Start with positivity. Start with what is working, what you hope comes out of this. We talk about this a lot, like duration, pathway, outcome. It's like, how long is this going to take? What's it look like? What's the outcome? And so you can talk with some positivity about some of the things they may be doing and just ways to kind of modulate some of those behaviors so they kind of go in the direction that you want them to go, but also hopefully the way the kiddo wants them to go. Regulate emotions, like I said, goes without saying. This is something that you would want to practice. You'd want to have your kiddos practice ahead of time, so that way you can do that in real time. And if you need to step away to regulate and then come back, that's really important. Share your concern, to be empathetic towards the other person, be understanding of their point of view. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but just try to understand their point of view, understand where they're coming from, why they may be feeling the way they feel, why it's important that they do or do not do the thing that maybe is in question. Ask how and what questions. Tone really matters. Like, how come you're doing that versus how come you're thinking about it that way, or what could we do different? What are some other options versus like why? Why tends to feel a bit more accusatory. And listen to this in conversation when someone says why versus how and what, and see how you are feeling when that comes across. But how and what tend to be more exploratory and more open-ended, which allows you to be more empathetic, to understand the point of view, and not just kind of dive right in with yes and no's and be the problem solver in that moment, particularly with your tweens and your teens, but also with your kiddos too, just to understand their perspectives, have them share some of that emotion that also may help regulate them over time. Setting expectations for the future, kind of like, setting those limits, what you're wanting, what you're needing, and then reinforcing any positive outcomes that happen, any sort of movement about the thing that you've talked about, that you've seen a change in thought or a change in behavior. You really want to cheerlead that when it comes to parenting these hard things that kids are dealing with on a daily basis. And you're seeing just a little bit of change in that trajectory with that behavior. You really want to be positive about that and let them know how much you appreciate what they're doing and the effort they're putting into it. So another good thing for all of us, particularly you as a parent, and for your kiddos too, is, how is your human recipe? Most of the time, it's not as healthy as it could be, but this is just a level setter that allows you to manage stress better, allows you to have better relationships, allows you to be more empathetic. And so it's a nice way to set the day throughout the day to make you as optimal as you can be. So for you as parents, having really good, strong social networks that have reciprocity, people that care about you, that you can lean into, they can lean into you, and kind of be there for each other and talk through certain things with each other. Really, really important. We are social creatures. Your teenager's little brain awakens with this whole neural network that was asleep prior to them turning to tween and a teen, that is all geared towards social engagement and finding the people, finding their people. That's why they do wacky, fun, interesting, and sometimes dangerous things. It's because it is just testing and building that neural network. And so you are sensitive to that, and you also yourself need this strong social network. Sunlight's important in the morning and in the afternoon. It kickstarts your circadian rhythm. So by kickstarting your DSC, which collects throughout the day, and then kicks into the melatonin at night and triggers that so you can fall asleep, stay asleep, that kind of stuff. Which brings us to sleep. Sleep's super important. It's super important for you, your kiddos. Um, Eating the right stuff, kind of going back to that information diet, like eating the right food for you, and what you put in there is going to have great implications and magnify in a good way or bad way the body. Exercise, people are not exercising enough, and we need to do more exercise. There's really good studies that if you exercise, it's just as good, if not better, than taking an SSRI. So even if you don't have depression, it helps with mood substantially, among many other things that it does. Um, Doing things that you're passionate about for you as a parent, that way you feel recharged. Doing things that are challenging, so you can continue to work on that resiliency muscle. This is important for your kids too. School inherently is challenging a lot of times. There may be other things that they're interested in that are challenging, such as their hobbies or their sports, things like that. And then if you take supplements and medication, make sure those supplements are third party tested. Supplements are not regulated by the FDA, which means that if you're taking something, you may not be getting the full extent of that medication, or in some instances, you may be getting too much of that. So 500 milligrams could really be 1,000 milligrams, or it could be 50 milligrams if it's not third party tested. And then medication is FDA regulated. So what you're taking is what you're getting. And if you're supposed to take those things, then obviously you'd want to. That helps you be healthy and have a good, healthy human recipe. So the things that you can do to mediate your stress level, if you're dysregulated, these are things you'd want to practice daily, but also things you want to practice ahead of time. So when things do get rough and tough, you can use this tool, and you would practice this with your family. The double breath is one way to turn or dim down your sympathetic nervous system, which is right here. That's the activated nervous system when we are in distress, so like we're under attack. And if we need that, great. If we don't, if we're too dysregulated given the environment, so if your level of stress right now is like a 7 and you're sitting here listening to me, and you probably shouldn't be a 7 given the environment. So hopefully not. But the double breath does a really good job of dimming down the sympathetic nervous system and turning up the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the one that's just kind of in charge of the background. It's in charge of, digestion and letting you know you're hungry, or even fingernail growth, hair growth. Um, and because those things are not necessary if you're under attack. So the double breath is just deep breath in through the nose, another breath through the nose. The first breath is as deep as you can get it, like you're going to swim to the other end of the pool. And then you breathe out through your mouth. So I'll demonstrate. You do that a couple times, and your nervous system's higher than you want it to be, you'll feel it fall off. You'd probably do it 3 to 4. If you're really high, if you're like 8, 9, or 10, you may need to do it 4, 5, 6 times in a row. But it will dim that. It's quicker than medicine. These other ones are kind of self-explanatory. Obviously, things that help level out your stress level are humor, prayer. If you're spiritual, asking for help. Doing all the breathing techniques, which just means like if you're thinking about your breath, counting your breath, whether it's box breathing or yoga breath or nostril here, nostril there, like you're immediately thinking about breath and you're not thinking about the thing that was stressing you out. So those things work really well too. Um, any of the relaxation techniques, the mindfulness, the yoga, meditation, people that practice mindfulness versus people that don't, are stressed in study after study. Not only is it lower, they handle it better when it is on board, right? When it becomes dysregulating. Get outside as much as you can. Beautiful today. Hopefully you can enjoy that weather. And then pain relievers if your stress is really high. And pain relievers is a short-term solution. It's not a everyday kind of long-term solution, but just basically when we're in emotional distress, the emotional distress center is right next to the physical distress center in our brain. So it's going to pass the blood-brain barrier. So if it's affecting the physical part, it's also going to affect the emotional part. So that can be helpful on a short-term basis. We have developed a chatbot called the Healthy Human Recipe chatbot. If you have an OpenAI account, they are all free. You can go open an account, you can scan the QR code, or to give you access to the chatbot. Chatbot is full of how much sleep should I get in, or how much should sleep should my kiddo be getting, or my child wakes up in the middle of the night and they have a hard time falling back asleep. You can say, hey, let's make a story for a 10-year-old boy who likes soccer to help him fall back asleep. And it'll create a script for you to practice that. And then that can kind of become a mantra. It helps you find places where you can exercise. It helps you find social playgrounds where people you can meet up with. So if there's a mom's group in the area that you're interested in, maybe you have a child that's on the spectrum and you'd like to find a mom's group. Like, it's giving you access to resources and really good high level information about ways that you can take care of yourself and take care of your family, and give you answers to some of your questions when it comes to the stuff that we talked about that was on that Healthy Human Recipe. So, like I said, it's free. Be happy for y'all to use it. Hopefully you do, and hopefully you find it useful. And that is the end of our talk. We try to keep them to right around 15 minutes. If you have questions, you can put it in the chat or you can unmute. And for any of those of you that are listening to the recording, there's the email address, lmdcounseling@lmdcounseling.net. You can go to the website. Go to the website, you can send an email there, you can sign up for the newsletter. We try to do these talks internally once a month or so, every 4 to 6 weeks. And then we're happy to come out into the community. I know we're giving a talk tomorrow at Providence Springs Elementary. We gave one at JM last week. So, we're going to churches and schools and businesses, depending on the topic you're wanting to discuss. We have a lot of different talks that we can do, and we love to do it. And most of the time, it's free of charge. So, happy to hang around for a couple minutes if anybody on the call has questions. And if not, I appreciate y'all being here. You're welcome. Well, y'all have a great day, and enjoy the weather, enjoy the fall weather, and get outside as much as you can. All right. Thanks.